Morning, everyone. We'll give folks another minute to log in. All right, I've seen my clock tick over for a minute. I think we have critical mass, though still missing Emily Levin, and I know she's got a lot of different things going on. Is likely to join us.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I just wanted to say hello. My name is Ashira. I'm the EAG facilitator, so I'm stepping in today for Catherine just to help open the meeting, and then I'll hand it over to you all. I did want to check in to make sure that everyone was okay with staying the extra 30 minutes. So instead of a 1 hour meeting today, we would be having a 1.5 hour meeting. So if you could just put a thumbs up, uh, virtual or visual. And so if the people who have their videos off, if you can just put a virtual thumbs up, that would be helpful. Awesome. I see them coming in. Okay, great. So it seems like we have a good amount of people who are able to stay. Um, and with that, I will hand it back over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ashira. And with that, can people see my screen? I just wanted to, or I do want to frame our discussion today. We had an excellent meeting last time. Did not have our opportunity to meet as a breakout group at the last tag session. Since we last met, the PUC did come out with their pacing straw proposal. So that is our number one topic today, to go over that, review it topic by topic, and incorporate um, the work product that I know each of us were bringing different things to. We're planning to bring different things to this meeting. So I know, TJ, you had something from the department. Haley, you were thinking about the analytical perspective, and I was looking at the logistical point of view perspective. And I believe that the PUC did a nice job organizing the key elements of what we've got to address in their straw proposal. And I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this. The TAG leadership is planning to set aside a full hour for this group to present to the full TAG our response to the straw proposal, and also the other work we've been doing with respect to the pacing details in preparation for preparing comments that we will provide to the commission based on the straw proposal and the request for feedback by June 19th. So the two key things that I'd like to discuss today, and welcome any revisions. Figure the first hour we will be going through the straw proposal topic by topic, and the last half hour preparing for how we'd like to present our information at the TAG meeting. Any thoughts or comments? And I'll also put this in the chat, the link. I'd encourage people to have have the straw proposal in front of you if you can. And just to facilitate the first part of the discussion, I have broken out the various components in this slide. So any thoughts on the proposed agenda there? As if it makes sense, either virtual or on camera, thumbs up.
Sounds good to me. I just wanted to note, Michelle, that the department was preparing some one pager on pacing, but I think the PUC's for this group's consideration, but the PUC's proposal kind of supersedes that, and I think we're best suited to just bring up what we were talking about or what we were going to put in our one pager in the context of the PUC's draft proposal. So, or
I
straw
agree.
proposal. So
I agree.
I just
that
wanted
makes
to,
perfect sense.
yeah, I just wanted to, since you mentioned it, I just wanted to set the expectation that we aren't bringing anything, formal to the table today.
Exactly. However, you're bringing the thinking and the discussions that have taken place will be contributed to today's conversation. And I do want to acknowledge that the PUC did put a good bit of the input that this breakout group and TAG in general have provided to date on pacing. It has been incorporated in here. So we're in a good place. The collaboration has been established and we're in a good place continue with this. So I took the key elements of the straw proposal in the slide that's shown right now. And I know not everyone has access to a computer screen. These are the 5 main process topics that were expanded upon in the straw proposal. So they go in essentially the sequential order of what's required to keep our preparations for eventual implementation of the statute, keep that on schedule. So the first topic is the emission schedule, the regular review, 3 and 10-year review and updates of the emission schedule. The topic of carbon intensity values, then the specific emissions reduction requirements for the thermal sector. And really what is the end goal of all of this work right now is, again, the process to establish annual requirements for the registered obligated parties. There was a 5th topic of low and moderate income equitable distribution that has been set aside at this time. So our main points of discussion are those 4 first topics. I just summarized what was there. So if we could, well, I'd like to go through these topic by topic. So if we can start with the emission schedule. Thoughts, comments on that particular topic? And this is what is defined in the statute, that it should be laid out for 3-year and 10-year reviews and updates with input from TAG and the public as part of that process.
Yeah, this is a component that I don't think us as a subgroup have, touched on much, just because it overlaps, I think, so much with the bioenergy, if that's the right word, subgroup or life cycle mission subgroup. But yeah, so I didn't have a lot of opinions necessarily on this topic, but felt like the process established in the straw proposal felt pretty in keeping with the statute. Yep.
Thanks, Haley.
I agree. I think a process of reviewing and updating periodically every 3 years makes sense. The one question I have around this is that, so the emission schedule is the life cycle emissions rate for heating fuels and any fuel used in a clean heat measure, including biofuels. That kind of relates to the customization of GREET topic that we
Oh,
flagged
absolutely.
at our last
Absolutely.
full tag meeting, in that I do have a question about whether it will be allowable for people to propose their own like custom life cycle analysis of their own sort of specific like industrial biofuel project or whatever it may be. So, and I apologize, I read this last week, so I can't remember if this appears somewhere else in the staff proposal, but the question I have that I think is probably worth some tag discussion, but is outside the scope of this group, is, you know, what do you do then? Like, if that's not an option, then that's great. You can just update everything every 3 years and everybody is on an even playing field. But if there is like a customization path, it just feels like that this might be a place where that would need to be laid out or noted at least.
You bring up some good points, Emily, and I do want to acknowledge that the GREET discussion that we had in the customization from the last tag meeting, very informative and helpful here. I do believe that part of the 3-year review will be taking into account any changes or customized projects such as that, those sorts of topics. I do believe right now this is simply the first step for establishing that process. So deciding on what customization of GREET will be involved and how it will be applied is definitely a big part of this stage. I don't know. Other thought, further discussion? Again, so many of these are going to be open-ended at this point, yet it's important for us to identify what those key points are. So what version of a customized GREET or similar tool and what projects will or will not be allowed, I think will be important points to capture.
Yeah, I'll just chime in also to say we generally agree with the process to have a consultant review what is effectively the measure characterization for clean heat measures going forward. And to Emily, your point, I think there does need to be a process for custom measures. I think that's contemplated. I don't know if that would be this review, but it's really where a obligated entity can come up with a calculation for a custom project that would then be reviewed by either the department in its verification role. That's what happens in Tier 3 or with Efficiency Vermont often, or the TAG or the PUC to actually kind of have a review of that custom project, both before to kind of give it a reality check to it, but also afterwards to verify the actual savings of the custom measure. But I think that's maybe a different process question than what is being contemplated here, but really important to note, I'm sure, where it goes. So maybe it does go here.
Yeah, I was kind of picturing like a footnote, just because it felt to me like if we did have a custom pathway, then that might not be on the same 3-year schedule as everything that's more prescriptive.
I think that's an important point. We'll make sure that we've got a note about that, the consideration of custom projects. I also see Alex has a hand up, and then Victoria. Or maybe Alex had to step away, the hand dropped. Both hands have dropped. Any other comments, questions on the specifics of the proposed process for the emission schedule? And again, at the beginning now, we're getting our initial reactions and responses and identifying key points for further discussion.
I guess the only other thought is that, and this is related to Emily's thought, is that there may be not necessarily a custom project, but some measure that is a prescriptive measure that the tag may want to add to be a eligible measure and how that is proposed. And I think that also is another area of process that I understand the PUC is working, but it's related in terms of if they're hiring a contractor every 3 years, they may want to have that contractor available in the interim as well.
Deirdre, if you're here, is the intent to have a long-term consultant or a consultant to review these and do this these 3-year reviews and updates, or would that be something that was bid out periodically?
I don't think that piece has necessarily been ironed out, and sorry I was a little bit late, so I missed the beginning of this discussion, but I just wanted to, I think I joined when talking about kind of the emission schedule, and I just want to differentiate. I think it's between the emission schedule and measure characterizations specifically. So I think the commission is working on putting out a proposal on, it might just go directly into the draft rule to have comment, but reviewing custom measures or reviewing, new clean heat measures, for instance. So I do see that as distinct from this. And I think, TJ, to your point, it will probably borrow heavily from the tier 3 process and, involving tag there. So just wanted to chime in about the distinction there, and that is, I do see that as separate from the emission schedule that would be on a potentially 3-year cycle. But I
Deirdre,
think,
could you just state kind of in your own words, what is the difference between the emission schedule and the measure characterization?
I can try.
Pop quiz.
So, I mean, I guess, yeah, it'll be difficult for me to do this well, but, I see the technical reference manual, including both the emission schedule that has literal rates of, I don't know if it's going to be in the form of carbon intensity scores of each of all the fuels, including electricity and including biofuels, exactly what the unit will be in a table of emission rates. Whereas the measure characterizations I see as more of the ability for tag, for instance, to assign credit values, because they'll say if you're replacing an oil furnace with a fully ducted heat pump system, you're saving this amount of emissions. So I guess, is that helpful at all to that distinguishing that way?
I might try to help here too. I think that was helpful, Deirdre. Emily, I took the slides back to the first part. I think of the emission schedule as what we were talking about a meeting or two back when we were trying to look at the greenhouse gas inventory and figure out what our slope of the lines would be. And the measure mix, the carbon intensity values, those are going to be part of the equation that we eventually come up with for that reconciled thermal emissions reductions requirements. So the emission schedule is, if other people can phrase this more clearly, please jump in. The emission schedule is the overall target that's defined in statute for the reductions that are intended in the course of the clean heat standard work.
So unfortunately, this is the thing that catches everybody. It's so poor, it's poorly termed, I think, because schedule, I think, does draw you to think of like a trajectory. But emission schedule in statute is a schedule of life cycle emission rates for heating fuels and any fuel that is used in a clean heat measure, including electricity, or is itself a clean heat measure, including biofuels. So one thing that we actually talked about recently internally was like almost stop calling it emission schedule because it's so confusing, and start calling it, life cycle emission rates for fuel or something that's like a little bit clearer.
Right. Yeah, I was just looking at that because I think what Michelle just described is the required amounts.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the emission schedule is more like a list of life cycle emission rates for various fuels. And so Deirdre, I get that, like, going back to your attempt to define this, which I think was helpful. The measure characterizations relate to like what is actually, allow you to calculate what's actually happening on a site. So there are things that are clean heat measures, like a heat pump, that aren't directly an emissions rate. But for the fuels, I think it is pretty one-to-one. Like if I'm running like biodiesel or renewable diesel, if I have the life cycle emissions rate times the quantity used, and the TRM isn't going to have the quantity used either, because you're going to, that's going to vary based on the project. But that would, I think, be. So I think for the fuels, it basically is the same thing, I think.
That's right. That's how I kind of understand it too.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so many of these terms like schedules and rates and credits are like, they can be used in different ways, and I find that we have to like at least I have to keep reminding myself of like which is the intended use.
Yeah, exactly.
And what are we talking about, like dollar units or carbon units, or like what are we doing?
Yeah.
And I went ahead and juxtaposed this topic with the next one, which was talking about the step change. So looking at our time, are folks okay with moving on to and we are making these notes here, and we'll discuss in more detail later in this meeting. Could we move on to the process for the carbon intensity values?
So just very quickly, maybe benefit for me mostly, but so on that first review of emission schedule on the proposal, sounded like people were mostly okay with that approach, but want to make a note that, even though if the commission does see the process for reviewing new clean heat measure or new potential clean heat measures or custom measures as a separate process to this, just making a note that this group would like to make sure that is done maybe on a more flexible basis. Is that the takeaway from the first part one?
I believe so.
Yes,
I think so. With a clearer definition of what we're talking about, I don't know that it really is super applicable to the comments on this itself, which is really, unless we think there's a new fuel that may come available that needs to be have a factor or an emissions rate,
I think
within 3 years, or that we need to adjust them. But yeah, I mean, I suppose somebody could make a proposal to adjust a life cycle emissions rate in the interim, but having it every 3 years gives the market stable
Mhm.
guideline to respond to. So
All right. That's helpful. I just know that, you know, we want to, we've asked this group to develop, you know, the reaction to this really quickly. So I just want to make sure that that was kind of tied up before we moved on. So I'm good to move on from my end.
Okay. And I'll adjust my discussion so that we get that wrap up before we move on to the next topic.
Sounds good.
So part 2, and again, I know this is tiny, but I tried to take the key parts of it, was the process for setting declining carbon intensity values. So we're presuming over time there's an impact of the clean heat standard, the numbers and the value of implementing the measures, applying the clean heat credits will be changing over time. And at this point, the commission has proposed that there be use a step change, adopting the limits that are right there in the standard for figures at 2025, understood end of 29, and 2030, and eventually working to 2050.
So I'll start on this one, I guess.
Sure.
Just I just want to make a couple of observations, and I think that maybe is step one for this group anyway, is one, the step change function is really simple and predictable, and that has a lot of value in the marketplace, I think, as far as what the technical impact of that is. It kind of gives a understanding to market players on like what actually will be eligible. The second thing I want to point out is that it may be useful to have some of that predictability and just set a path now from 2030 to 2050. Could still have step changes in 5-year increments, just to kind of continue the rate of decline in the interim and not have just a giant step change in 2050, but kind of set that expectation. Just to, again, have that predictable rate of change. And the last thing, well, I'll stop there and I'll mention just to see if anybody else has reactions. The last thing is perhaps a little more complicated, so stop there.
I don't have a lot of comments on this. I agree that step changes make sense. I agree that predictability makes sense. I generally thought this proposal made sense. I could see the benefits of TJ's suggestion of also laying out the pace of decline after 2030. Now, I would want to make sure that the department had the benefit of a little bit more information on where we currently are with the current suite of fuels, you know, so maybe some of the, I don't know if it's the potential study results or just some, I guess we'll have that in time, but I personally have a question of like, well, where are we now? I assume the carbon intensity values of the current fuels are generally pretty high, but it would be helpful for me to feel like we had some data on the current state of things to inform this conversation. But with that said, the requirements for 2025 and 2030 are pretty clear, so it makes sense to me to just define them now.
My only kind of reaction to this was more of like from a reader perspective. I wonder if it would I would find it helpful to specify just that the statute, I believe this carbon intensity in this statute is only tied to liquid or gaseous clean heat measures, or like, yeah, those sorts of fuels in those clean heat measures. So it might, well, just from a reader perspective, helpful to specify that here. Because what I would interpret that to mean is just like a wood or an electric sourced measure. This sort of reducing intensity value isn't applying to those. So yeah, not sure if other people agree, but when I just first read it, it makes it kind of seem like every measure would have this dynamic impacting it.
Hmm. Is that a comment we can make? Simply a recommendation that we make, Kaylee?
Yeah, if other folks agree, and again, I don't think there's anything in this that conflicts with like that statutory interpretation I stated, but from a reader perspective, maybe in the justification section, just a reminder that this is for applicable to the liquid and gaseous clean heat measures and fuels.
That sounds okay to me. I think that's right. I have one other technical question for folks.
Oh, I've got that.
Where
I've
we
got that
move on from that,
noted.
but I don't want to move on till we're ready.
I think we are. I think we are. That's an important point, and I like the approach of adding it, including it in the justification. So we've got that documented, Haley. So your second topic, TJ.
Okay, well, this isn't the one that I was considering, and actually, I don't know if I will present that, if I can explain it properly, but the one I wanted to bring up right now is just clarity on the year by which the CI score for eligible fuels will have to be below 60. It's below in 2030. The compliance year for so does that mean January 1st, 2030, or for calendar year 2029, which is the effective year that we need to meet the GWSA target?
I did excerpt, so I edited out a few things just so these slides wouldn't be too even more full than they are, and they did have notes in there. I'm trying to remember if it's on this in this topic or elsewhere, where they acknowledge the fact that we've got lags and that it needs to be for 2029. And now that I'm looking at it, it's mentioned elsewhere. So that's a good reminder that we've been discussing, at least thus far, that the understanding is that it's by January 1st, 2025, so that the figures would need to be by the end of the previous year.
No, I think the language, that's how it works in the inventory that Matthew just said by January 1st, 2030. This language is different. It says below 80% in 2025, not by 2025. I think to me that implies that it is in the calendar year of 2025 that below needs to be achieved, and in the calendar of 2030 that below 60 needs to be achieved. So I actually read that.
So
That's
you
my
read that as-
interpretation. I would agree that it would be potentially helpful for the PUC to clarify that point, because it's clearly not super obvious, and it's especially if it's operating differently than the greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah, so that is really my question. Thank you, Emily, for articulating it. And I don't know if I mean, this is the one of perhaps many issues in how the legislation was just crafted, and something this complicated, this kind of stuff just happens. But you know, I find it hard to believe that they set the target for 2030, you know, and then for greenhouse gas reductions and pointed everything to that, which is calendar year 2029, and then put this requirement, meant for this requirement to take place a year afterwards. That may just be what the plain language says here, and how it is, but I, you know, I suspect they meant for this to be kind of the emissions reductions target to be met using CI, you know, fuels with a CI score of 60 or less for the 2030 target, which is calendar year 2029. That may not be what they wrote down in the statute. So, you know, having some clarification there would be really helpful.
Another good point to include in our feedback. So you said this wasn't originally your topic, TJ. Did you have one more before we move on to item 3?
I guess I'll just point out, it's just another observation, is that the you know, having the step change kind of slows it is, the step change is different than the trajectory on which the obligations will be set, and so it essentially allows for fuels with a carbon intensity, you know, of 79 up through 2030, and that has some implications in the marketplace, in that kind of the pace of a reduction in carbon intensity from fuels lagged the actual emissions reductions requirement pace. And I think what that may mean is just that you have to, you know, do more homes with a carbon intensity fuel of 79 in order to meet your targets. But it's just kind of an observation that that the pace lags under the step change for 5 years and then kind of catches up. And you know, if you set it at another step change in 5 years, it would lag again and then catch up, and then lag again and catch up. And that may be okay. I just wanted to observe that as a implication of this marketplace.
Definitely an important point.
Theoretically, you could have it lead also if you went to, you know, if you went to 60 in 2025 right away, then you would be leading the, you know, emissions reduction pace. And I don't think that it's necessarily the right way to go, but just the way it here is, it's lagging it. Hopefully I explained that observation clearly enough.
I think you did, and you reinforced in my mind the fact that this is both a sequential and an iterative process. Any other thoughts?
I think we should keep moving because we have a lot to discuss on the next
I'm glad you agree, Emily.
items.
Yes, the other one is really the meat of the process leading up to the setting the annual requirements. So topic 3 was a proposed approach to set the reduction requirements for the thermal sector. Starting with establishing this is in the straw proposal, establish the baseline, linearly at this point, project the next 10 years of reductions, incorporate the reconciliation, the translation. I don't think we have a really good word yet for converting the greenhouse gas emissions figures into the life cycle based emissions numbers that are the heart of the clean heat standard tallies. And the commission has proposed using the same greenhouse gas emissions trajectory for the life cycle based emissions. And then also incorporating the potential study into any required adjustments to that trajectory. A lot of information there. Let's start with the proposal for the baseline, which I know has been the
Is
topic
this
of
actually
discussion.
I think we would all agree that there has to be a baseline. So that part I agree with.
Yes,
But
the
then it's
details.
one option is to better normalize the thermal sector's reported emissions totals from the most recent greenhouse gas inventory and assume no progress has been made in lag years. I mean, this is exactly what we've been talking about, is what is our baseline year. And then we also found out that we have the fuel data and can probably get, like, from the tax records, and can probably get data for like 2023 or even 2024 by the time this is finalized, which also could be used as a baseline. So that language, it seems like the commission proposal is to establish a baseline, but because they use the word one option, that makes it seem like they aren't proposing, they're considering, but you know what I mean? I just want to clarify.
Again, this is the process. This is the process that we're setting up. So that would be, and again, I've edited the full content here.
Yeah, what would this group think about recommending when the wording comes up, from the most recent year offered in the greenhouse gas inventory, modifying that to most recent tax year of tax data. I think there are pros and cons to that, because we know that inventory is likely to move to the tax data, but in 10 years, maybe it moves to a different source. And you wouldn't want that to then conflict with the process and the rule. So, but given that it is more recent data, it would seem helpful to reference that more recent tax data in the process rather than be based on, a 2 or 3 year prior year in the GHG inventory.
I agree, and I think that's where we landed after our past meeting. So I don't know if we need to totally reopen this question. What I was looking for, and I don't have this right in front of me, but the EAN paper that I sent you all, I went to the event they held last night, and they showed, like, they had a slide that showed, here's the greenhouse gas for the thermal sector for 2022 and 23, based on the tax data. So they had already done the math to calculate that, which indicates to me that it is possible. We might need to check with Colin Smythe about the language. So maybe we need to say adjusted tax data minus off-road diesel or something like that, because there is that off-road diesel thing that
and the commission does note that in the document.
Yeah, so
highlighted that part out.
yeah, maybe we can think a little bit about the exact, making sure we get the language right, but it seems to me that that was our recommendation as of our last meeting. So I guess my question is whether anyone wants to revisit that, or if we should kind of stay with that and recommend that back to the PUC.
It sounds like an appropriate comment, feedback from us. At this point, we've been consistent there, and what I'll leave it at that.
So I'm fairly agnostic. I think there's some value to having it be tied to the official inventory. The tax data has value because it's more recent. And I think when we went over the numbers, the difference in kind of the annual pace didn't seem, there was a difference, but it didn't seem so significant. I don't know if we actually did 2020 pace, but it didn't seem so significant to spend too much time on. So I think it go with groups recommendation.
I just put in the chat the slide that they showed where they had calculated this, just so folks could look at it and see.
Thank you, Emily.
And so pace being not that much different if we started at 2.87 and drew a line to 2030, or started at 2023 and drew a line to 2030, and the resulting obligations in 26 to 2029, I don't think were hugely different.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So perhaps make a note that both of those resources, the greenhouse gas inventory, the information feeding into that, and the tax data, acknowledge their two resources and make sure that's considered in the process.
And
But
then,
maybe the target for consistency and goals for the long term. Go ahead, Haley.
well, yeah, just thinking about like 5-7 years out, if this does create a market that is driving pretty significant reductions, that would further seem to point towards the most recent data as being a benefit rather than a couple years lag. If we think of basically that differential, maybe between 2022 and 23 isn't that big now, but in future years when a market's more active and robust, it could be bigger.
I agree with that. I lean generally towards using the best and most recent data we have, which is, I think, the adjusted tax data. And it's been helpful for me to hear from Colin that is also the method the inventory is going to switch to. And what he sort of said is that, if they were just doing this for the thermal sector, they could just use that data and do it much more quickly. And the only reason there's this lag is because of like delays in data on some of the other sectors. So, it's going to be in the inventory eventually, basically. Like we can get a projection of what, with a pretty high degree of confidence, what will be in the future inventory, and just use that like several years before it is formally published in the inventory.
Right, we're capturing all these thoughts.
Do we want to make a recommendation on the weather normalized piece? I'm inclined to think that it would be better to weather normalize.
That's my thinking as well.
Yeah.
So positive feedback, that is part of what we are providing here, both things that we believe are in the straw proposal that will support the targets of statute or the goals, and where we propose either clarification or adjustment. So thank you. We'll reinforce that weather normalize support for the weather normalization. And the next line is where there was the comment about the obligations being met at the end of the calendar year for the target years. Any other thought at the moment about the process for projecting the emissions for targets? Emissions reductions targets. I created a word there.
Yeah, just should it be linear or some other pattern? I think we've discussed this before and we're in general agreement that it made sense to just use a linear approach for now.
Glad to hear that we're still thinking that way. Excellent.
So I have a question. If you, I don't know if everybody reads this the same way, and so maybe it's just for a clarification. So I think I agree that we discussed the linear trajectory to calendar year 2029 requirements and the pros and cons of that, which, like, if our group was to make comments, we might want to put those on paper, of like, hey, we could front load or back load, but we think linear was the way to go. My question is just, maybe this is a wording thing, but it is the proposal in your all reading for it to be linear, like a line from the baseline to 2029, and that same trajectory continues for 10 years and then go to 2050? Or is it a line from baseline to 2029 and then a new line from 2030 to 2050, which would have a different trajectory, right? The first line is steeper and then be less. So it's not clear to me exactly what was meant there, and I think I have some implication of that.
I think that's a very good question. And actually, now that I'm looking at this again, thanks for being a close reader, TJ. I think we've only really focused on linear projecting the first 5 years of emissions reductions to 2030. So that part I feel confident about. I think I could be convinced otherwise, that in the carbon intensity, there was the prior process, the PUC proposal was to kind of like have an opportunity for public input to inform the step change or rate of decline, from 2030 to 2050 or 2031 to 2050. And that generally kind of makes sense to me. Like, I think we're going to learn a lot from the first few years of Clean Heat Standard implementation, and I'm not sure that it makes sense to lock ourselves into a pace of, or a pattern, as linear, as if like exponential or whatever else it might be. I don't know that we need to lock ourselves into that now. I think there could be some benefit in establishing a checkpoint in like 2030 or whatever it would be, when all of this is like revisited and a new baseline and trajectory established. That's an initial thought, but welcome others to weigh in.
I appreciate this coming up for continued discussion, because in my mind I was reading into it that the slopes, that there would be review points and adjustments made. So it's clear for us to understand, are the same 3-year and 10-year review and adjustments. Does that also apply in the course of this stage of things?
Yeah, and I think it depends on when those reviews might happen. If we're saying it's 2028 that review is happening, that might not give enough certainty for, calendar year 2030 reductions if that review doesn't end until like 2020. So when it starts and finishes, I guess. But I don't know. It'd be really Deirdre, I don't know if putting you on the spot here is you can just say no, you don't want to be on the spot. But were you thinking with this a straight line for 10 years or a line that kind of bends after 2029?
So I think, and maybe I'm gonna try and see if I understand the question, but so I think we just have to, well, I'm just reminding myself that you just have to determine an initial 10 years of reductions, correct? It's not, you don't really need to go beyond that initial 10 years. Does that sound right?
So 10 years from
Matthew had pasted some language in the chat. Is that in the law, or is that just from the PUC proposal?
From the proposal.
Okay.
So thank you, Matthew, for putting that chart in the chat. This is the question I was asking is the proposal to kind of, if we're doing 10 years, maybe we don't go all the way to 2050, but to go to 2029 and then the linear trajectory from 2029 to 2050, which kind of creates a
Sorry, that is what
bend.
that is what the proposal is implying, is that there would be a bend. You wouldn't have 2050 tied to the baseline. You'd have the 2050 tied to the 2030 goal being met, I think. And that would be a projection. That would be a very big assumption, obviously. But and I don't think we would be basing credit obligations in those decades. But I think for the purposes of the program, I guess that would still be a useful projection. But yeah, that is what I think the proposal is implying. And that's a good comment to make that probably more clear.
Yeah, thank you. Because we were, you can see that first steep trajectory. If it just meant one straight line, then you'd be meeting the 2050 target in like 2036 or something. And so, or maybe even before that. And so having the bend makes sense. So I think that would be the comment, is to clarify that trajectory.
Yeah, and I think that because it's talking about 10 years, but you're starting with 2025 or or either 2024, like it sort of, it implies that then the bend is happening in 2035, which is I think also not what you mean. So yeah, I think there's a way to clarify.
Oh, I see. Yeah, because so 10 years would go beyond obviously the 2030 goal. So you'd probably have to have those first years tied to the 2030 and then those 2030 to 2035 be linearly tied to meeting the 2050 goal. So there would be a bend. It would just, it's not neat because it's not going to be aligned with the goals. Yeah, that's a good point.
And just for reference, this chart, I think, uses 2026 as the starting date, as the first obligation year, but we had just talked about a baseline. So just, this is for example purposes only, not, not actual, I guess. thank you, Matthew, for putting it together.
Definitely a big help there. Thank you.
I have one other comment on this sort of the emissions reduction requirement process. Assuming, are we all done with discussion on the trajectory? Seemed like it, but I don't want to move us to another topic if we aren't.
No, I think we should keep moving because the
Okay.
next two are like we've only done the easy parts.
Yeah, well, sorry, my comment is not quite moving to the next one, but for folks that have the proposal in front of them, so under this emissions reduction requirement section, under number 3, the sub-bullets under number 3, 3C talks about using the emissions factors identified in the ANR life cycle based supplement to the inventory to determine the upstream emissions of each fuel type. And I wonder if that should instead reference the emission schedule, and by emission schedule meaning the life cycle emissions rates, that is, occurs elsewhere in the proposal and is in statute. Because I mean, obviously those emission schedule could very well be based on the ANR study and supplemental values, but it would just make sense for me that what's being referenced and used should align with the emissions schedule that the commission decides to adopt, just in case that diverges from the ANR supplemental study. Is that was that clear what I described, or
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
this was just as like commentary. This was, we also were kind of unsure about using the emission schedule / life cycle emission rates that the technical consultant comes up with for the program versus kind of the ANR. And I think it's, again, like this tension between, this program is really tied to GWSA and like the way that the inventory is put together. And I know the inventory doesn't include upstream. But I think that was sort of some of the justification of using the ANR emissions factors, because of this step is really trying to tie the program's goals to meeting the inventory. So just wanted to mention that that's kind of some of the justification behind using ANR resources here and using the emissions schedule, elsewhere. But I think it's a valid point. I think if the subgroup suggests being consistent and using the emission schedule in this step as well, then that's a valid point.
Yeah, that was the number one thing that jumped out at me when I read this. I was like, oh, the department is essentially guiding us to, like, I sort of interpreted this, if you use the ANR life cycle based supplement, in my mind that has to match, because otherwise you end up with 3 sets of books instead of 2, and 2 feels like plenty to me. So, to me that implies that the PUC is saying, like, adopt the ANR life cycle assumptions and reflect those in the emissions inventory. You know what I mean? Because I couldn't quite conceive that we would be having 3 sets of books. Like, I guess I'm agreeing with Haley that from a process perspective, I think tying it to the emission schedule is more clear and leaves us the, we then have the opportunity to revisit the emissions factors. I mean, we may well decide to just adopt what ANR used, but theirs wasn't really done for that purpose. And, this is obviously like the very contentious issues we're discussing with the whole biofuels work group. So I just didn't want to assume that we would adopt that wholesale. And I also think in your scenario, Deirdre, where they didn't match, we had an emission schedule and then we had the A&R life cycle based supplement that then I think we still have 3 sets of books, and that just seems like extremely complicated to figure out. I think we should try to avoid that basically.
Yeah, and it could mean that the percent of life cycle emissions you have to reduce doesn't align or like stack up with like the life cycle built up in the credit obligation of that year. Because if it's based on 2 different books. So yeah, to Emily's point, my gut is sort of that you would want the emissions that's informing credit value to be the same that you're using to adjust the inventory from inventory to life cycle. TJ, are you have a thumbs up or a hand? Sorry.
It was a thumbs up. I was trying to save time, but mission failed there.
That works. I think that's an important point for us to include in the commentary. And we can work on the exact language of that between now and Thursday. The next line item, and I am keeping an eye on timing. We still have a whole nother topic to cover here. The straw proposal did include using the same rate of decrease. So for the life cycle based trajectory, having it be the same that was applied to the greenhouse gas inventory, so that the same trajectory that we started with would be applied for this first stage of things. I don't know if I'm at this point defining that clearly.
I think it has to be because, again, like we need to have a consistent translation between the 2, emissions estimates. And if they are varied in their trajectory, that just introduces like another variable. So certainly, I think they should always be aligned. The language here talks about using the results of the triennial potential study to determine whether it is appropriate to adjust the decade trajectory to something other than a linear decrease in emissions. To me, that's like actually slightly different language, I think, than was in the prior section around the 10-year, where we identified that was a little unclear and would sort of, to me, implies that maybe there's like a checkpoint around sometime around 2030 to kind of like revisit and lay out the trajectory from 2030 to 2050, which I generally support. But so I think somehow the language here and the language previously around that checkpoint and the later year trajectory probably needs some clarification and to make sure it's consistent. But yes, I definitely agree that the method should be consistent.
So I think the language here in number 5, 3C5 is different than before, the earlier language about the trajectory, and is okay to be a little bit different in this instance, because the way I read it anyway is that this is where we kind of have that check on and what the department had put forward before is needing a measure mix to make sure we're hitting the trajectory, because we have 2 separate books, the inventory-based accounting from the GWSA and life cycle accounting for creating clean heat credit values. The potential study will create kind of like a optimized path, or given kind of workforce constraints and other constraints of how we might meet the targets. And each measure has a different impact on a life cycle basis than it does on a GWSA basis. And so if we just set those trajectories consistently with that linear approach, we could end up over complying or under complying by a lot, depending on what measures might be installed, right? Like a biofuel measures will still have a carbon score and a life cycle impact, and you need to get many more of them, but all of those count as zero emissions in the inventory. So we might set a trajectory too aggressively if it was just linear, because those biofuel measures will count differently in the inventory and make it look like we overcomplied. And so I think that 3C5 is a really important step, and it is it's different than it's okay to have it be somewhat different, and those trajectories could be different as a starting point. Having them tied the same makes sense, and then look if we need to adjust it to account for the legislature requiring us to keep two books.
So TJ, just so I'm understanding it, is it when you're talking about the two trajectories, is it like the GHG inventory reduction trajectory versus the life cycle emissions trajectory? Are
Right.
those the two? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I guess I see what you mean. I guess I was picturing it's like, is it a chart with two lines where they're parallel, but just one is more than the other, which is what I was picturing, versus like maybe you need a different, sorry to be like acting this out, which
visual help.
I don't quite understand that well enough to know which of those scenarios we're in. I was assuming the former, and it sounds like you're assuming maybe the latter. Yeah, this issue is like our discussion on the last tag meeting was very helpful for me. I'm pasting in a note that I got afterwards from Dr. Collinward that was also very helpful to me in kind of crystallizing the tension in the statute. And so I'm just going to mention it now since it sort of relates to this point. But he's noting that there are two ways to resolve this tension and sort of accomplish the reconciliation. One is to design the life cycle analysis accounting to reduce the disconnect, which would it would lessen those disparities, depending on how you accounted for upstream emissions. And, if you didn't include as much of the out of state, like avoided methane and things like that, then you might end up with a smaller disconnect. The other, if you have a very generous view of upstream emissions and you start accounting for a lot of out of state impacts and generous avoided greenhouse gases from biofuels and things like that, that's going to increase the disconnect, which means you're going to be paying for a bunch of things that essentially don't count, which is going to raise the overall cost of the program. And then you're going to need greater reductions from the stuff that does count. So I don't know, that it really is a quite fundamental tension. And I don't think we know yet how we're going to end up resolving that.
Exactly. This is an important discussion, and I'm glad that the commission identified these as two separate bullets, and it clarifies, or for me, it helps to define why this is also complex. Because as TJ pointed out, there's different value towards the ultimate goals by different measures and as a function of time. So from a process standpoint and for comments that we want to make, What would, is there specific language that we'd like to add to what the commission has either in this, the proposed approach or the justification? Or it's still dependent upon, or in my mind, I wonder if we continue to reinforce the points that more information, the numbers, the absolute numbers are still required for the actual implementation of this. We're still looking at the process at this point.
I might suggest just adding, whether it's in the justification or in number 5, something like that, this may result in a differing trajectory. And I screenshotted Emily doing the 2 lines, so we could just put a picture of her.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was actually really helpful. I thought, Emily, so but, and I didn't take a screenshot, but I think it, you know, some sort of clarity just to illuminate that for other readers could be useful. You're muted.
I do agree with
Yep.
what I think we are agreed on is that so it could end up being a different rate of decrease depending on what we learned from that reconciliation method, but it is still going to be a linear line. Like, we, under no scenario, I think, would you end up in a case where you're like on a straight line for the inventory and then you're on like a U-shaped line for the life cycle, right? Or do we not know that?
I'm not sure if we know that.
Great. Okay.
But to think about that.
I don't know that this, I mean, for taking a step back, for what the PC is trying to do is to lay out a process. I don't know that they need to get into like referencing specific rates or patterns of decrease. I think the general method laid out here is to like construct a different kind of trajectory based on the life cycle based emissions. That step makes sense to me at a high level, and maybe they can just elide some of the details of exactly the pace of change until we have actual data. I think the more important point is the one Haley raised, which is that to me is, I don't know if anyone disagrees with that, but to me that's a very clear comment to replace that A&R life cycle based supplement to the inventory with a reference to the Clean Heat Standard emission schedule.
Important topics. I do have to note that I just looked at the time again. And we are 10 minutes from wrapping up our call today. So there's still the process of setting and adjusting the annual obligated party requirements, which basically all come out of the steps we've been discussing and applying the percentages that are called out in, or applying the percentage approach that's called out in the statute. Before we get into that, this group is, do we feel as a group that we are at a point where we're ready to discuss this with the larger tag next week? And I mean, in general concept, recognizing that we need to draft our notes for this, that I'm proposing to do the first pass at that and get it to folks between what day? Between now and Tuesday. I hope that's enough morning, just because, and then have more abbreviated discussions of this with the full tag. Do we feel like we can do that, or do we need one more meeting before the full tag meeting next Thursday?
I do not actually have time for another meeting before next Thursday because I'm traveling, but I do think, I mean, the process Deirdre asked us to do is to try to draft our full comments to share at that tag meeting and then, you know, revise them following the meeting. So if we wanted to accomplish that, I do think there's probably a lot to discuss in the process for setting and adjusting obligated party requirements that I don't know, maybe we could take the rest of our time to just touch on that really quickly and just do our best to write it out. Because I think, you know, if we could at least take a stab at just documenting our best guess of what we think our comments are.
And I think we've been quite clear for the topics prior to this. And I agree with your thinking, Emily. Do folks have time to review an email to have the iteration take place email over the course of Monday and Tuesday? I'm traveling tomorrow, so
Yep,
first time
I
I
do.
can get a draft out would be for Monday.
Thank you, Michelle, for offering to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I'm gonna ask Matthew the time that to indicate how much time he has. I have a big case that there's a technical hearings next week. I likely will not be at the next tag meeting. So luckily, Matthew has done a lot in formulating what we think on this pacing proposal. So
yeah, I have general flexibility. There are a few obligations that I would prefer not to have to miss, but if the only time available is a conflict, then I can tag someone to sit in for me in the other obligation.
right, and I think we're talking about responding to comments on email and such as well. So
yeah, and I'm gonna try to participate at least in the opinion dynamics presentation at the tag meeting. I'm at a conference, but I'm facilitating a session starting at like 11 a.m. So based on our current draft schedule, that would mean that I would miss the pacing subgroup discussion. So I just wanted to note that TJ and I maybe might not be there. So, but I think having weighed in on the original proposal, that's fine. And maybe we can listen to the recording later.
Well, we'd appreciate you. We do have Rick Weston on at least listening in today, and we may be able to adjust the location of this conversation well, you're on that committee, Emily. Is it possible to adjust it so that you're available?
Possibly if we delayed the PUC update and eliminated the break or did that later.
Or at least say the first half of the pacing comments.
Yeah, we could maybe start, if we started the pacing comments by like, 10:30 or 10:25, then I should be able to participate in part of it. But there's a full hour for that. And I don't think there's any chance I'd be able to participate.
Right. Understood. And we can front end things or backload things to maximize the pacing subgroup members' attendance for that discussion. So those are some logistics things we'll work out behind the scenes with we have 4 minutes for the section D or section 4, the obligated party requirements. Thoughts or topics that jumped out at folks looking at this too as a detail. There were 8 steps laid out. Any topics of concern or points that we definitely want to explore further.
I think my thinking was generally in alignment with this process. And I think it was helpful that the commission highlighted the fundamental conflict in the statute about the percent of each obligated party's contributions from a prior year being used as the proportional percent. Yeah, anyway, that was good to call out. And if there is something from the commission on that point that would be helpful from us, I'd be interested in knowing if there is something that we could help with on that point, but that does feel like a conflict that's pretty hard to get around.
Unless if we start using the tax data, that's apparently available in like February of the next year.
Does that
So-
have by obligated party? I don't actually know what that data is. I assumed it was just like an aggregate.
It is, but a percentage.
It's definitely
Say-
going
Oh,
fuel
right,
type,
yeah.
but
Because it's going to be the registration data, I think, that the obligated parties file with the commission that will provide that, like their percent portion, or their.
Is that
their portion.
registration percentage being updated too every year? I guess I that's a really good flag. Like I guess I had been interpreting that as referencing, they said that the issue here is the lag in inventory data, not the lag in registration data, and then also that they need to publish a decade's worth of credit requirements at a time, which I think would mean that can't be, like, if I'm a fuel dealer and I'm 8% of the total emissions in 1 year and then 14% the next year, like, I think that doesn't get adjusted every single year based on registration data. I think you just have to use whatever they were during the baseline year and then assume that it stays, right?
I think in this process, they were recommending every 3 years updating. And I could be misrepresenting it, like updating that portion, because it does look like registrations are filed every year. Or like that is an annual process of obligated parties registering.
Right, yeah, actually that's in number 7. Yeah, that makes sense to me, but still, like, I guess, but then if you're doing it every, right, okay, so that would be the lag if you do need the, depending on when that's available for the last, anyway, okay. So I think hopefully Deirdre's listening and can understand some items that need some clarification here, but I don't think we're having a major disagreement with the process, just the question of clarity.
I'm not sure just to chime in, I'm not sure I totally understand what the tag recommendation would be. So in 4B, where we point out the conflict, that last sentence just says the commission proposes seeking a statutory amendment to tie credit requirements to the most recent inventory data instead. So I guess that's the specific recommendation, at least from the proposal, that we would be looking for. No, that doesn't make sense, or you should.
Well, I guess that's discussion between me and Haley. Deirdre, to me is, my question is whether there is a conflict based on the lag in inventory reporting data, because if we shifted to the fuel tax data, that is available pretty quickly. So were we to shift to that method, we might not have that lag in inventory data. Point number 1. Point number 2, there may still be an issue with a lag depending on when the fuel dealer registration data is available, giving you the percentage of each fuel dealer's contribution, because maybe you also need that part to be available.
Yeah, I
And
think so. So that quotation in there is in statute. So that's where I feel like there's less flexibility. So it says percent of each obligated party's contribution to the thermal sector's life cycle. So the thermal sector is just that substitute for the inventory, right? The RCI part of the inventory. So to me, that gives very little flexibility in terms of you can't use, well, so I guess I would.
yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I guess, you know, I think it might be debatable because if you use the same method that that A&R will be using for the tax, using the tax data, and you just do it 2 years in advance of when the full inventory is published, then arguably you're still using the inventory data. But I think you could debate that.
Yeah. So I guess I would suggest, so that makes sense. So if you could follow that line, that like line of logic through all the steps, if you were placing, you know, fuel tax data from inventory and just follow it through the whole steps, and that would very well be like a meaningful thing to say, okay, you no longer have this conflict with 4B if you use fuel tax data. But I guess I would just want, rather than that comment just to be applied to like this, you know, 4B, I would want to make sure that the tag has followed through on that data suggestion through all the steps, I guess is my.
Yeah. So I think that is my recommendation, and maybe like talking to Colin about exactly how to phrase that so that it is reflected clearly and deals with that off-road diesel adjustment and anything else that needs to be noted.
Quick question. I know we've gone over time, so we will have to wrap up. Does anyone know, is Colin invited to the discussion as a resource for the next tag meeting? For just this segment?
I don't think so.
Would that be appropriate or overstepping on his time?
You mean for the pacing subgroup recommendation section? He probably has not seen this proposal unless anyone has sent it to him. So
Okay, just a thought. We're referencing greenhouse gases. It may be we continue to reach out separately to him as a resource with questions between now and Thursday by email.
yeah, I think that's a good idea to have him vet the tags recommendation maybe.
What I'm struggling with, which I think is not a feedback, and I have to run, I'm already late to another call, but like, I think this process generally makes sense in here. But I'm trying to play this out, and I'm picturing a scenario where there's an obligated party that contributes like 0 or near 0 to the inventory based reductions, but has a significant amount of reductions using the life cycle method. It's just interesting. Like, I don't know. I don't quite know what to do with that, but
the fundamental tension here.
yeah. So I would like to spend, I'm hoping at maybe one of our future meetings, and I don't think that we need to do that for this process proposal, but if we could get a little deeper, especially once we see the opinion dynamics proposal on the actual reconciliation method, I think that will be an illuminating discussion.
Absolutely.
And I need to run at this point. I am just noting what Rick put in the chat, which is if somebody will try to make the agenda work, and if somebody reaches out to Colin, please copy Brian Woods.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Key action items, continue studying this straw proposal and be prepared for draft comment. It will be relatively rough, but first pass draft comments that to summarize what we've come up with here today. Have that to you by noontime on Monday and ask for comments back and forth over the course of Monday and Tuesday.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for facilitating.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
rest of
you.
your week.